We're starting the first of three chapters really on the cardiovascular system. Not um, blood is listed. I guess I'm mumbling because blood is on test two, but we more or less put it in association with the cardiovascular system. Blood is the liquid connective tissue that is housed in the vessels, which we call arteries and veins. The liquid connective tissue is moved around by the heart, so it actually has an association with the respiratory system too. So it's a good, I guess, bridge between the material on test 2 and the material on test 3. But blood itself is the non-living matrix, which is the plasma. That's the straw-colored liquid, and then the formed elements that are found in the plasma. So it's the combination of the two. Now, the plasma is the connective tissue component. Those things that are found in that connective tissue plasma actually are cells that are embedded in the connective tissue. Just like you have cells embedded in connective tissue, whether it's dense regular, dense irregular, etc., you have the formed elements, which are red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, as well as proteins, gases, nutrients. All of these things are found circulating in this non-living matrix we call plasma. And so the concept of blood creation, or the word that means blood cell formation, is hematopoiesis. This occurs in the axial skeleton, portions of the axial skeleton, in what we call the marrow. And you probably learned something about this. Hopefully you learned something about this in 141. But in newborns, or in preemies or newborns, so those babies that are just about ready to be born and are born, red blood cells are made in numerous places throughout the body. In the adult human, red blood cells are made in the sternum, in the ribs, in the ilium, the hip bones, just in certain areas in the head of the femur and the humerus, in certain areas in the axial skeletal system. The process of making formed elements, so this hematopoiesis, comes from a stem cell, a hematopoietic stem cell. And that gives rise to all the formed elements, whether it's a red blood cell or a white blood cell. That is a process that's highly controlled, as most step-by-step processes in the body are. Certainly by hormones, also growth factors, that would push the components or the offshoots of that hemocytoblasts, sorry, I forgot a portion of it, push them to a specific pathway. And we talk about that later in the chapter, and you'll see an image about that later in the chapter. General functions of the blood: deliver gases, O2. Certainly we just finished talking about the respiratory system, so this can't come as that much of a surprise that delivers gases. So carbon dioxide and oxygen both are carried in the blood in certain forms, as well as nutrients such as glucose, hormones, nutrients such as glucose, and I'll stop, because this pulls in your digestive system. You learn quite a bit about the digestive system in terms of how foods get broken down and then absorbed into the bloodstream, and this is the bloodstream we're talking about. They get absorbed into. Also carry waste products, the waste products of cellular respiration. Again, a little bit about the, I'm not going back into the Krebs cycle or the TCA cycle, which are both the same thing, different names for the same thing. But there is a byproduct, whether it's anaerobic production of ATP, which the byproduct would be lactic acid, or whether it's aerobic production of ATP and the byproduct is going to be CO2. Plus, the cell has other byproducts that it puts out that it doesn't need. These are going to be released into the interstitial fluids and then taken into the bloodstream either via the venous return or whether it is the lymphatic system and then into the bloodstream. Maintain temperature. Liquid, the plasma is mostly liquid, and water has a high heat capacity. So since it's mostly water, it helps you maintain temperature. Also maintain pH with regard to a nice buffer system that's circulating around in blood all the time. And it maintains the pH of itself. Blood wants to stay at 7.35 to 7.45. Not so much that the blood wants to, the body wants it that way. And then also fluid volume. The volume of the return to the heart is constantly being monitored via the right atrium. So the right atrium has mechanoreceptors that are picking up stretch. If there's too much blood that's returning to the heart, then there's going to be a message sent to the brain that then is going to send messages to the kidney, time to get rid of some of this fluid. So you actually have the cardiovascular system working very close with the urinary system. Certainly protection of blood loss with regard to clotting, and that's what platelets do. There are also antibodies, and white blood cells are part of your immune system. Think of neutrophils, think of lymphocytes, but also antibodies are circulating in the blood. And then we did talk about nutrients and hormones already. So quite a few functions of blood. A pretty nice list of functions of blood. The components of blood, what we have here is an image of somebody getting their blood drawn and into a tube, into a centrifuge, spinning it, and then what that does is it causes the heavier portion, which the formed elements would be. Erythrocytes are most of the formed elements, about 45% of whole blood, let alone of the formed elements, 45% of whole blood. Of the formed elements, red blood cells are about 99%. But then you separate the formed elements out, and then what you have is a little layer, a little white layer, which we call the buffy coat, and those are the white blood cells and the platelets. So if you look at the spun blood, you see a straw-colored liquid at the top. That's the plasma, about 55% of whole blood. Then the buffy coat, which is the sum total of white blood cells and platelets, and then the erythrocytes, which is about, those are red blood cells, about 45% of whole blood. And they do tend to be heavier, so they tend to go to the bottom of the tube after being centrifuged. In terms of the components that are found in plasma, and by the way, you have a nice spotlight two-fold picture in your book, which is a nice way for you, a nice stop and look at all of the information that's on there. I couldn't get it on my PowerPoint because it wasn't very clear in terms of, because it became very small. But it starts on one side with the spun blood and what you find in it, and then expands each piece. So expands the plasma into plasma proteins, solutes, and water. Expands the formed elements into platelets, white blood cells, and red blood cells. And as a matter of fact, that's what we're going to do, is we're going to expand it, but just not in that same image. But your book kind of has it all together there in one page, or 2 pages, I guess you might say. With plasma, water is the major portion of it. It's just a water for many reasons. Water is a good form of transportation, good for that temperature resistance, and also a very good solvent. Salts. Sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium chloride, bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is that wonderful buffering thing. So it's an ion, so chloride is an ion. Sodium is an ion. Many of these things, they're all ions. They don't all participate in the buffer system, but they're all ions. They also are solutes. So that participates in the osmotic balance. That osmotic balance is very important with regard to a chemical concentration outside the cell and inside the cell. So you have these ions that are in the blood, and when they get to the cell, they will go into the interstitial fluid, and because they help maintain a balance, and as a matter of fact, a positive balance that will actually pull the fluids back into the bloodstream from the interstitial tissue. We talk about this a little bit in the chapters on the cardiovascular system in terms of images, in how blood will go through capillary beds. It will move, the fluids will move on out into the interstitial tissue, and then the fluids will move back into the bloodstream. And it's thanks to these osmotic these things that are floating around in blood that give it osmotic pressure. Plasma proteins do the same thing, as well as plasma proteins have specific functions. Fibrinogen is there for part of the clotting cascade, and then immunoglobulins are there to become antibodies, and then you have albumins, which are they were there to actually contribute to osmotic pressure, albumins. Then other substances, glucose, fatty acids, vitamins, gases, O2 and CO2, and hormones. So quite a bit that's being carried there in blood for each of your individual cells to use. Remember that glucose is the monomer of carbohydrates. Fatty acid is the monomer of fats. Sorry about that. I should have put all this up all at once. But there you go. There you have the proteins also listed out. Erythrocytes, they are biconcaved, so they kind of look like a Lugens lodges. I forget what they were called, but I don't even think they make them anymore, so I shouldn't even use that as my description, but kind of a cough drop. They kind of look like that. And they are anucleate. They're kind of interesting. They don't have a nucleus. They had a nucleus when they were born, but by the time they born, in kind of parentheses, I realize this is an anatomy lecture, but when they lose their nucleus, when they are considered mature and go into circulation. They are just packed with this hemoglobin molecule to allow them to, each hemoglobin molecule can carry 4 oxygen molecules, and there are thousands and millions of hemoglobin molecules in a red blood cell. So they are just oxygen carrying machines. And the interesting thing, and I probably put it on here somewhere, or I told you this before, is they don't use any of the oxygen themselves. All of their metabolic behavior is anaerobic. So they don't use the oxygen themselves. They don't use the CO2 themselves either that they carry. But they are excellent at carrying oxygen. They have this structure, so 4-part structure, 2 chains, 2 alpha chains and 2 beta chains. They lack a mitochondria. Men have a few more than women, and their lifespan is 100 to 120 days on average. They tend to be, they are destroyed by the spleen. It's kind of a combination of the spleen and the liver working together, because as much as can be recycled will. We'll pick it up on the next one.